All right, howdy. First of all, thank you for coming to this artist talk and reception for Shawn Smith and his exhibition, Dissonant Data. Before I introduce Shawn, I'll introduce myself and say a couple of thank yous. So my name is Rebecca Pugh. I'm the curator of the Wright Gallery. I'm an instructional assistant professor. I teach art courses and manage the gallery. I want to thank all the helpers who made the exhibition possible, including gallery assistant Ronaldo Yanez, Professor Felice House, and artist Dana Younger, and of course Shawn Smith and his spouse, Anne. So I'd like to introduce Shawn. He was born in Dallas, where he attended Brookhaven College before graduating with a BFA in printmaking at Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri in '95. He received his MFA in sculpture from the California College of the Arts in San Francisco in 2005. His artist residencies include Cala Art Institute in Berkeley and La Cité Internationale des Arts in Paris, France. And he's exhibited his work in museums and galleries in many countries, including Norway, France, Finland, and several US states, at venues such as Austin Museum of Art, Grand Rapids Art Museum, Oakland Museum of Art, and many more. He's being commissioned to create several art in public places projects, also known as public art, in Fort Worth, San Francisco, the Bronx, and Niger. His work can be found in collections of the Smithsonian Art Museum and the National Museum of Wildlife Art. And his corporate clients and private clients, just some of them include Facebook, Microsoft, Google, W Hotels, and more. So he's going to talk about his work for about 45 minutes and take some questions at the end, and then we're going to have a reception in the gallery until 6. So let's give him a round of applause to welcome him.
You guys hear me okay?
Yes.
I should probably be that close. All right, well, thanks for having me, and thanks for coming out to the talk. I do have a few moments here where I'll probably ask for a little participation with some hands or throwing out answers, so feel free to just throw it out there. All right. So starting off, does anybody know what this is? Pong, yes. So this is Pong. This is one of the very first video games that was introduced into the home. And for those of you who don't know what this is, it basically plays like ping pong, where you just sort of knock this ball back and forth. So I was born the year of Pong, and I'm part of the first generation that sort of straddles that line between having the digital in your house and having real objects in your house. For most of my artistic practice, I've been interested in using information and data and turning that into like a physical form. And I'm very inspired by systems and interesting collisions between objects and media and information. So here's one of those other questions. Anybody here know anything about War and Peace, the book? What do you know about it?
My sister's read it 3 times.
Oh my gosh. Anything else? Anybody else know anything else about it?
Isn't it about the war between France and Russia?
I think
It's Russian front, right?
Yeah.
Wars?
Yes. Anything else? Or Prussian, I think. But anybody else? So it's incredibly long. It's over 4.5 million words. And kind of put that in context, like if you've, well, it's 4.5 million words. Anyway, so I used to work with books as a material for a long time. Actually, you know what? Sorry, I skipped a slide. I'm going to go back. I think I hit the thing too hard. Let me back up, sorry. So for a long time, I was using books as a raw material. And I would cut them, fry them, sew them together, candy coat them, bake them. And I'd use themes from the books to inform the object. So sorry, I got a little ahead of myself. Oops. Going the wrong way, I apologize. All right, so now we're back to War and Peace. So this is a book project that I was working on to kind of bring those two things back together. And so knowing that this is 4.5 million words, I wanted to try to find a way to kind of echo that process in working with the book and try to personify that in a way. So what I did for this project is I took the entire book and I took a hole punch, a little 3/8 inch disc hole punch, and I punched the entire book out. And then took needle and thread and I threaded all these little things together and made these little ropes, basically. So there's 15 chapters in this book and 2 epilogues. So I'm just going to say 17 because that number is going to show up a lot. But so I created 17 different links that are all based on the chapter that it came from. And then I put them all together and I created this portrait of Tolstoy. And kind of give you a sense of how big this is. The shoulder to shoulder is about 10 feet. It's about 8 feet tall. You can kind of see the electrical outlets there to kind of give you a sense. So when I put all these things together, I enjoyed the process. It took me a long time, and I kind of wanted to keep going with it. So I was kind of thinking, like, what happens if I took all these down and I put them end to end? How long would that be? It's roughly 130.1 feet long. So I basically kind of created a measurement. I created a Tolstoy. So using that, I was thinking, well, I'm going to keep going with that and see what happens. See, I did it again. Should I not be hitting the space bar? Is that what?
Maybe the arrow keys work better.
Okay, maybe I'll do that better, sorry.
Like left and right.
All right, I'll just do it that way. So I created a book, and with my standardized measurement, I wanted to explore this idea. And so again, there's 17 chapters in War and Peace, so my book echoes that, and there's 17 chapters in my book. And there are also, the book is 17 centimeters cubed. So inside the book, I created different chapters where I measured a lot of different things. And the chapters include things like art, very small things, the earth, everything in my apartment at the time, astronomical units, sports-related things. And here's a page from my book. And so on the left is an example from very small things. And I measured the helium atom, which is approximately 7.367072389 to the negative 13th power, Tolstoy's in diameter. Kind of funny, right? And then on the other side is the tallest mountains by continent. So Mount Everest is 223.17 Tolstoy's height. Another book project, this is around my first year in graduate school. And I think this is one of the last book projects that I ever did, but it was a project called Re-Frankenstein. And this was very pivotal for me when this project was done. So anyone here ever read Frankenstein?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so in the book, it's one of my favorite books, and what I wanted to do is I wanted to kind of do like a find and replace project with this, but instead of doing like replacing one text with another text like you might do in a Word document, I wanted to replace it with images. And this is, I'm dating myself here a bit, but this is back when Google was kind of a new thing. And using Google image search. And so the way Google image search kind of works is the first image on the, I think it's on the far left, is like the first most popular image of that day. And it changes, it moves around. And so I created a program with a friend of mine that basically goes on and scrapes the web with a text. So I took the entire story and every word would get replaced by that most popular image from Google. And that's just what the whole, sort of the book sort of looked like. And being that the date was kind of important, or that it changes around, we ran it on Mary Shelley's birthday, and she would have been, this is like her 208th birthday. And after looking through this, and if you haven't read Frankenstein, there's a lot of connections to natural elements like forests and glaciers and these different things. And after looking through the book when it was done, I started to think about my own relationship to nature, and I realized that I don't really have a relationship with nature. I grew up in a city, and so I was thinking about like camping. Like, I have never been camping. I've never spent the night under the stars. And I realized that my relationship to camping is something more like this. So this is Pitfall from 1982, and it's a game where you basically, you run around and the whole point is to touch nothing from nature or you die. So here's a graph that sort of spans my lifetime, and it shows how much screen time has accelerated for my years on the planet. And at this point, I sort of decided to refocus my work on the disconnect between the digital world and reality. And I became fascinated with the concept of how we experience nature through screens. So in my last year of graduate school, I kind of made this pivot, and I decided that I wanted to challenge myself to create something that was translated from nature into pixels, in this case a deer. And I tried to make it in a very naive way, as if I had never seen a real deer before, and I only knew it from a screen. And I spent weeks trying to figure out how to do this, and you can see on the right, like I would cut the pieces and I would tape them together, and they wouldn't be right, and I have to take it apart and just keep going. This is about 3 months worth of work, and that's working probably 7 hours a day, 7 days a week. So I had to sort of figure it out on my own, and that's one of the things I like about being an artist is that you come up with these very strange problems, and you have to find your own way to solve them. There's no off-the-shelf solutions a lot of the time. And this was the first of a series of pixelated animals. So there are some other early forms that I was working with, and at this point I was really trying to be able to control the forms so that the identities I was working with actually came out the way I wanted them to look, and also controlling color and pattern. So now I'm going to pivot a little bit, and I'm going to talk about sort of what the process, and it's kind of the same way that it's probably the same then as it is now, and it's changed a little bit, but I'm going to kind of talk about it. So I basically would start with something I'd find online, some image of something, and a lot of times it's something I've never seen in real life. So in this case, it's a pufferfish. And I wanted to, at this point, make the process as laborious as possible to kind of offset make a contrast between the speed and the slipperiness of the digital world. So from there, I make sort of architectural drawings, orthographic drawings, maybe 2 or 3 views, and what that ends up helping me do is figure out the volume and the shapes, and I call these maps because they help me to kind of guide around the sculpture as I'm building it. And then I actually start the cutting process, where I'll start with a full sheet of material, cut it down into strips, and then on the right, you can see I start cutting things down into smaller denominations using that map to figure out how many pieces I need to make, and also what colors they need to be, what patterns are there. So you can kind of see in my studio, they're all kind of spread out, and they're all by shape, and there you can see they're hand-dyed at that point. Then I have to take everything, organize it back on a cart, and then that's actually when the building process starts at this point. I usually start from the center of the object and I work out towards the edges. The center is usually where, if it's going to be a wall-mounted piece, that's usually where the cleat is. This piece is a little different in that there's a box inside of it, and the reason I did that is to save some of the material and also to make it a little bit lighter. So this is building a little bit more. Here's sort of my little tiny dog on here for scale. You can kind of see now that the box is completely enclosed inside. And on the right is the finished pufferfish. Nope. All right, so now I'm gonna show a video, and it kind of echoes that process. This is a project that I did a few years ago, and I'll tell you some stories, but you can kind of see real time how the process sort of works. There's a few additional things like some welding and stuff, but I'm going to take you through 7 months of my life in about 4 minutes. And I had this is a stop motion camera, and it takes a photograph I think every 2 or 3 minutes. This is a commission piece, the Art and Embassies program for the U.S. Embassy in Niamey, Niger. And when I received this commission, the curator wanted me to kind of focus on some ecological issues facing Niger at the time. And so keeping with animal subjects, I chose to work with giraffes. And it turns out there's a very specific type of giraffe that lives in Niamey called the Peralta giraffe. And it's been there for many centuries, and it's very beloved. And these giraffes almost went extinct in 1990. There was approximately 60 of them left. And so Niger is a very poor country, and they have these really gigantic acacia trees, and the giraffes were using that as food. And to make money for the country, they were knocking these trees down, and then they were selling them. But 2 things happened when they did that. The giraffes ran out of food, and the desert began to creep into the city and become more arid. So once they figured this out, they stopped the logging, and the giraffes then had more food. They planted more trees, and the giraffe numbers came back to close to around 650. And there's a couple other little things I was going to mention about this. So working in my studio, I was trying to figure out how to get this to Africa. Like, how do you get an 18-foot tall giraffe to Africa? And so I figured out how to make this in pieces. And so I had all these conversations with the curators and the architects and the people that working at the embassy. And I would ask them, like, you know, nuts and bolts questions, like, how big are the doors that this has to go through, and how big is the elevator? And I had this really interesting thing talking to the architect about the elevators, and I asked him, and he's like, I could hear him on the phone kind of doing some math in his head, and he goes, the elevator is basically 2 gurneys wide. 2 gurneys. You know what gurneys are, right? For moving bodies. And I thought that was I was like, you measure things in gurneys? And he's like, we measure elevators in gurneys. And I was like, wow. I mean, I guess I can't really talk because I measure things in Tolstoy's, but that's a whole nother thing. So that was one of the issues that came up at the time. The other one is, as you can kind of see in my studio here, my ceilings are only 12 feet tall. So I had to figure out, like, how am I going to make an 18-foot tall giraffe? So what I did, made the body at the top, put all the steel in the legs, and then built the legs and worked my way down to the feet. And then eventually had to go back and take the body apart and then bring it down to the bottom and then build the neck up to the head towards the ceiling. The other issue that I ran into is I wanted to go for the installation, but it was not recommended by the Art and Embassy people or the State Department that I go to Niger for this project. So I had to figure out, how am I going to get these instructions, 7 months worth of work? How am I going to get this to be reassembled there? So my wife had this really wonderful idea to actually make a real-time installation video to send them, not like this, but like, you know, showing, like, you need this tool and you need this and the bolt goes here. And that was about 2 hours and 25 minutes. That's about how long it took them to put this thing together.
How are the little pieces staying together?
Glue and pin nails.
So you're gluing each one.
Yeah. All right, so let's see if this is going to work. Hey, okay. So here is the only finished piece that I have, the only finished image I have of the actual piece in the embassy. And this is actually in a part where the ambassador meets with VIP people, which I thought was a pretty wonderful place to be. And you'll notice on the right there's a window, and there's a sanctuary that the government set up for the giraffes to have sort of a respite area. And I wanted to make a connection between this giraffe and that, and this story. And so if you were to draw a straight line out that window from the giraffe's head, it's looking straight at the refuge. So here is the largest pixelated piece that I've ever made. This was a public art project I did in Fort Worth at a fire station. It's approximately 118 feet long. It's actually almost a whole Tolstoy. Anyway, so this is made out of 6-inch powder-coated steel plates that are individually attached to the wall. So at this point with these projects, I wanted to kind of move beyond just recreating these forms, and I wanted to try to layer on another conceptual layer to it and start thinking about different things to kind of weave into the meanings of these pieces. And I started reading about dataism. And there's a data scientist has a really great quote that was very inspiring for me. His name is Albert Laszlo Barabasi. And the quote is, "Dataism is an artistic practice that acknowledges how data has become humanity's principle of understanding nature." So for this particular piece, using that as some fodder, I did a sort of manipulation of the actual JPEG. So if you can take a JPEG and you open it up, there's a code in there, and there's a lot of different little numbers, and it kind of tells the colors and pixels where to go and live. And I wanted to kind of break that and see what happens. So what I did is I just randomly, in this long pages of code, I just started inserting quotes from Frankenstein at random places. And it actually broke the code like this. So you see at the top, it's got these little bands of color, and there's a few little bands or bits of color at the bottom of it as well. And then I just sort of layered that into my normal process of pixelation. Here's another glitch piece that I made, and I was experimenting with like how much of an identity can be distorted before it almost begins to completely fall apart. To give you a sense how big this is, about a life. This is a life-size zebra. And then trying to conceptually enrich the pieces again, I began to think about other ecological issues and also the post-animal. Meaning how humans have changed the animal's ecosystem on Earth and how we've changed animals based on our wants and perceptions of beauty and necessity. So this is a silverback gorilla. There are about 1,000 left in the world, and they're endangered due to habitat destruction, war, and disease. The pixelation here is kind of a deconstructivist perspective. The identity is getting distorted, and there's details that are being omitted from this. And almost as if the species is sort of de-resing right in front of you. So this kind of brings me to the rhino piece in the gallery. And this was a bit of a paradigm shift for me, both for process and content. It was the first piece that I ever designed in 3D modeling software, and I appropriately used Rhino for this. I also learned how to use Grasshopper, which is a parametric builder that lives inside a Rhino. And this helped me to sort of quantify the materials and reduce some of my labor time and also get rid of a lot of waste. And also, this was the first time that I used real and digital objects together, and I was very interested to see what sort of conversation that begins to have. So this is Sudan. This is the last male white rhino. It died in March 2018. There's only 2 left. There's 2 females left in this. And the species has vanished because people are poaching the horns. And the horns are used for traditional medicine. They're worn as jewelry, and they're worn as wealth and power symbols. So I find mushrooms to be a very fascinating system. Most of the really neat stuff I think is underground. So when you see the fruiting bodies on top, that's sort of the tip of the iceberg, because the mycelium underground weaves itself into the roots of trees and plants, and it actually becomes like an internet of sorts, where trees can talk to bushes, and they can talk about threats, they can talk about resources, and they can share this information. They also decompose dead and decaying matter. So for the mushrooms that I created, I made them all out of clay, and then I made a silicone mold from them, and I pulled the clay out, and then I filled the mold with resin. And then I pulled the mushrooms out, and I hand-painted them. So this piece is called Harmony of Decay, and I really love the contrast of the bright and beautiful happy mushrooms growing out of this death of endangered species. Again, the pixelation shows the species de-resing out of existence. A lot of my work explores a contradictory subject matter, and the title of the show is Dissonant Data, and dissonant is a term that is sort of the opposite of harmonious. It's about clashing combinations that can be uncomfortable and unusual. So shortly before the pandemic, I was having lunch with one of my gallerists, and we were talking about ants in her garden that were invading her milkweed plants and eating the chrysalises, the monarch chrysalises that were there. And I explained to her that this is evolution. Like, not everything makes it. It's all part of a larger system. And after talking about this for a bit, she said, you should do an insect show. And I was like, I don't know. And then I thought about it later on. I was like, you know what? I do want to make an insect show. I think it'd be great, but I don't want to make little tiny pixelated insects. I wanted to challenge myself to think about it in a different way and approach it from a very, very different direction. And I'm still very interested in the pixelated works, but now I'm combining them with like other visual languages. So a group of butterflies is called a kaleidoscope, and millions of butterflies make a migration from Canada to Mexico every year, and they sort of congregate in these vines there. And the journey is about 2,500 miles long from Canada to Mexico, and they travel about 100 miles a day. And it takes approximately 3 to 4 generations of butterflies to make one half of this journey. One half being Canada to Mexico, and then another 3 to 4 generations to go back. The monarch population is under serious decline due to climate change, milkweed loss, which is their primary source of food, human sprawl, and pesticide use. So to the right is a population graph from 1994 to 2019, and I wanted to try to find a way to take this graph and turn it into something physical. So for the process for this piece, I took that graph and I projected it on my studio wall, made a drawing of it, and then I turned that drawing into a carved plywood structure, which is sort of the armature of this piece. And then for the monarch butterfly patterns, I took photographs of actual monarchs that I have that live in a tiny little specimen museum that I made in my studio, and photographed them and cut them out of paper. And in the computer, I slowly glitched the butterfly identities so that by the time you get to the right side of the piece, where the population gets pretty decimated, the glitches are a lot more prevalent. And I had a lot of fun with this piece, putting Easter eggs in here. And if you're a really astute observer, my face is in there many times. And the portraits that are on the other side of the wall are actually in this. So there's a fun little game to play. So after completed this piece, I was very inspired to create more works about insects and exploring our strange relationship with them. So these are cathedral termite mounds. They live in Australia, or they're in Australia. And some of these mounds can be anywhere between 15 and 23 feet tall. And it's pretty crazy considering that the builders of these things are about 3 millimeters long. That's basically the equivalent of humans stacking the tallest building in the world 4 times end to end. And I don't know how many tall stories that is, but. So considering that these mounds are made by cathedral termites, I wanted to create a play on words to reference our own cathedrals by building this piece out of stained glass. More than just a play on words, I wanted to honor these beautiful architectural marvels by giving them a value that humans can relate to. I've always wanted to learn how to do stained glass, and I thought, well, here's my perfect opportunity to do this. And when I told people that this was going to be my first attempt at doing stained glass, I mean, everybody thought I was completely nuts because people work usually flat. So here's kind of my process with it. Here's my sketch in Rhino here to begin. Basically, I got a hold of someone's research in Australia. They did a 3D scan of a termite mound. And I got the research, got the model, and I brought decreased the mesh polygon count way down to where it became sort of faceted with these triangles. And then I sliced it up and I cut it out of pink foam on a CNC. And I carefully drew in all the triangles, numbered them, and then I made paper patterns and then used the paper patterns to cut all the glass. Then you have to wrap every single piece with foil, and then you got to solder everything together. And then the pink foam was later removed. So on the upper left-hand side, that's me inside of it, soldering the piece together. You can kind of see the pink foam all the way on the left after I got it out. The bottom of the mound, this is actually the view from inside the mound. And on the bottom right is an Arduino chip. And if you don't know what an Arduino chip is, it's a little tiny microprocessor that you can use certain code to have it make lights do what you want it to do, or little electronic things. So in addition to the stained glass cathedral project, I also created a series of 4 collages based on animal architecture. And one of the pieces in that series is a cathedral termite mound. I think it's the one actually right as you come in the front door. And once again, I wanted to honor these structures by making these incredibly time-consuming to show their beauty and their grandeur. To create the collages, I cut up images from books of things that humans value. And then I took tweezers and some paste, and I glued every single one of them down. And in this case, the termite mound collage is made from books on old masters' paintings. Yep. Sorry. For the pink chrysalis, I used pictures from a book on rare orchids. For the golden chrysalis, I used images of gold. For the weaver ant nest, I used pictures from a book on the world's best golf courses. So continuing with my insect explorations, in the 16th century, when the Spanish conquistadors were conquering what is now Mexico, they came across beautiful red-colored fabrics. And they learned that the red came from ground-up bodies of a small sessile parasitic insect called a cochineal. And the Spanish began to export huge amounts of these little insects back to Spain to crush up their bodies to make the cochineal dye. And at one point, the cochineal was the third most valuable import, just under gold and silver. So after I learned about this, I started thinking about the treacherous journey of the ships at that time, sailing from the Americas to Spain, just to carry hundreds of pounds of these small little insects as a show of wealth. There are approximately 681 Spanish ships that were lost between 1492 and 1898. You can kind of see some of the lives lost over here on the right. The cochineal ink, also known as carmine or carmine lake, were used by several prominent European painters, as well as the fashion industry to create the red pigments. I decided to create a ruff as a symbol of wealth and extravagance, and I like the contrast between the perceived insignificance of the insects versus the gluttony and power of the wealthy. So here's my design. Again, I made this in Rhino, because I seem to do everything in Rhino now. And my design depicts male and female cochineal insects interspersed with abstracted Mayan imagery. The design was lithographically printed on linen at Flatbed Press in Austin and laser cut to create a lacy texture. And the actual cochineal insects I actually used cochineal insects in the ink for this piece. And the ruff was sewn together by a costume designer. Here is the finished ruff. All right, changing gears again. So flying above the Earth's surface near the equator in the summer months is an estimated 3,500 tons of insects. That's billions of insects just sort of flying around the Earth. And this aeroplankton consists of various insects and arachnids being lifted up in the air in various ways. And this phenomenon has been documented in some interesting ways as well. Basically, Charles Darwin talked about spiders that fell on the Beagle when he was on his way down to the Galapagos to write his famous book. That the spiders weren't there when they left, so how did they get there? Hikers on top of Mount Everest have talked about strange bees that have no reason to be there, suddenly are way up there. It's almost as if they just sort of fell out of the sky. So in the 1960s, there were some tests done in Louisiana to learn about the aeroplankton at different altitudes. There was a plane on the left here with these special buckets under the wings that would fly at a certain altitude, and then it would land, and then they would inspect the buckets to see what insects were in there. So basically, the plane would take off, fly at about 100 feet in altitude for X number of miles, and then come back, and then it would look in the buckets, and then it would go to 200 feet, and then up to 1,000, and on up. And during my research, I found there was, at 12,000 feet, they found one lonely termite, which is approximately 92 Tolstoy saw. Sorry. There were various amounts of insects found. Almost all of them were very much alive and unharmed. So I think you can see down at the bottom, 97% were alive and undamaged. So I found this little video, and this is kind of how spiders do this. Come on. So you can see the spider kind of hanging out here, and it decides it wants to go somewhere. So it begins to kind of check the air. Air current's pretty good. Gets ready, puts out a little bit of silk off the back, and then off it goes. You knew that was going to happen, didn't you? 'Cause I don't know how to get back. Oh, well, it's easy. All right, thank you. Of course. So the story of aeroplankton made me think about insects as explorers. Insects and arthropods setting out to find new worlds, food, adventures, mates, kind of like aviation pioneers and astronauts. And I thought it'd be fun to imagine what these spacesuits would look like for these little explorers. And it's amazing to me just how many of the people in this actually kind of look like insects with these strange suits. So for the series, I started with a 3D scan of real insects. And then in Rhino, I built suits and helmets, air tanks, and air hoses. And then I resin 3D printed them and covered them in various pigments. So these are all the ones that are in the show. But one thing I wanted to point out, the praying mantis at the top here. So some female praying mantises, they bite the head off their mates. And so I wanted her to be able to take that with her. So there's a little decapitation pod behind on the suit so she can take that head on her adventures. I'm so glad you guys are laughing. So in a similar way of measuring insects using airplanes, there's another interesting test called the splatometer test. There's a study done in Denmark between 1997 and 2017 where they, using the same car, going the same speed, same time of year, on the same road, would drive out and then turn around and come back, and then people would go and count the bugs on this car. And they used that as a way to test the insect density, the population of the insects. And it was recently revealed that the insect population has declined by 80%. So for my process with Splat, in Rhino, I set up I mocked up what the splatters would look like by projecting little balls at appropriately a VW bug. That's not what they used, but I thought it was kind of perfect. But I sort of mocked it up, and I threw little balls at this model, and then used that for my drawing, and I used pencils and archival markers for this. And just have one little thing that kind of crosses my mind every time I see this. Can you imagine like the response to this if someone were to do this, say, with deer or kittens? It's kind of interesting, right? Okay. So, by a show of hands, who in here loves bees? Or likes bees? Or, okay. Who in here loves or likes wasps? Okay, so significantly less. All right, so why is that? Why don't people like wasps? Yell it out. What is it? Wait. Too many. Wait, say again.
Bees give honey.
Okay, honey.
Wasps give pain.
They give pain, but they both sting, right? So it sort of nullifies that in a way. No. Okay. All right. So, so why is it? So people prefer bees because of they're pollinators, right? But what if I told you also wasps pollinate? And you mentioned honey. People like the honey from bees. But what if I told you there are some wasps that also make honey? So, I don't know. I'll get back to that. Sorry. I'm in my head. So some of the earliest wasps are from the mid-Triassic period. So they're over 240 million years old. And bees are about 70 million years old. And bees actually came from wasps. And there's an author named Syrian Sumner, and she has a great line that says that bees are actually wasps that forgot how to hunt. Wasps are also free pest control, and there's a whole class of parasitic wasps that take care of what we consider to be pests, like cockroaches. They lay their eggs inside of them. So people love bees, people hate wasps. People love butterflies, but they hate moths. We like dragonflies, but not houseflies. We like ladybugs, but not beetles. So we champion the cute and the colorful insects, and we vilify the others. Everything in nature is needed, even the cockroaches and mosquitoes. They're all food for something else. Even if you hate them, and I totally understand that, they're all part of the food chain in the ecosystem. So with that in mind, if I can move, there we go. We'll move on to NIMBY. So NIMBY stands for Not in My Backyard. And it refers to a 70s mentality about the implementation of large-scale beneficial municipal projects like power plants, prisons, and landfills. And most people want these types of entities, but nowhere near them or their families. So people love pollinators, we champion them, we understand the importance of them, but we literally don't want them in our backyard. So for this piece, this was a 3D scan of a wasp nest, which I manipulated in Rhino, and then the pieces were resin 3D printed and then covered with pigment. Similarly to the concepts of NIMBY, this sculpture is based on the shape of an old-fashioned flit gun. Basically, you kind of pump that handle, and that's where the insecticide comes out. So by changing the intended recipient of the insects to a beloved cardinal, there's a cognitive bias that shows up here. It makes us realize that we can't exterminate one pest without affecting the rest of the environment. There's a great book by Rachel Carson called Silent Spring, where she details how the use of DDT, which was an insecticide used in the 40s and 70s, was not only killing the intended insects, but also indirectly killing off generations of birds by making their eggs not viable. Sorry, heavy finger. Come on. So I have two favorite wasps I was going to share with you. The first being the ensign wasp, which is about 5 millimeters long and is one of the reasons we have green trees. And these tiny little parasitic wasps actually lay their eggs inside of caterpillars. And if it weren't for these little tiny wasps that you would never see, all our trees would have no leaves. So there's kind of there's a balance that begins to happen because this thing is alive. My other favorite wasp is a paper wasp, the Polistes carolina. And to show my love for the paper wasp, I created a self-portrait remnant, which is in the gallery. And this piece is about seeing myself as part of the natural equation rather than outside of it. And when I was making this piece, I was reading that there's some new research about wasps actually understanding the faces of their brood, and they can recognize them. They can also, like crows, they can recommend for a brief amount of time those that actually threaten or harm the nest. That's me in there, by the way. I don't know if that was clear, but. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Shawn.